Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Zevachim daf Gimel. We are already at the two dots, about 15 lines down on daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So yesterday we saw that Ravina told Rav Papa that he had missed out on some wonderful reconciliations of apparent contradictions that were offered by Rava. So we saw the first of these contradictions yesterday, and now it dealt with the fact that the generic intention, meaning if you offer a sacrifice without having anything specific in mind, other than whatever you're doing, but not specifically thinking about the nature of that particular sacrifice. So, for example, you don't specifically recognize that the offering that you're making is a sin offering or a shlamim or an asham, whatever, and you just think, I'm bringing an offering, that is going to work. But if you were to do the exact same thing, in connection with a get, meaning that you draft the get for in order to facilitate a divorce, and you don't specifically have in mind this particular woman. You might have written her name down, but you didn't have in mind this particular woman and this particular man. Well, then that does not work. And so we explained that why that's the case. We're provided the citations to explain that this is different. That halacha is different between the two. And so now, as we pick up at the two dots, 15 lines down on Gimel Amud Aleph, Rava details and resolves a second apparent contradiction. So to Rami Milsa Acharisi, he resolved a different contradiction. So, mi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Chatas sheshachata l'shem ola psula. If you were to take a sin offering, a chatas, and slaughter it for the purpose of an ola, that would make the sin offering invalid. That's one of the rules that effectively we had in our Mishnah. Shchata l'shum chulin kshera. However, and this is quite remarkable, if you were to not think about a korban at all, but instead think that you were slaughtering it in order to eat it, then it actually would be a valid sin offering. It has not, you can still amazingly fulfill the obligation if one has an obligation to bring a sin offering. This sacrifice that was set aside as a sin offering, but was slaughtered as just to eat, it can still be used as a sin offering. Alma. So what do we see from this? Demina macharivba. If something is more similar, because having in mind an ola is more similar than having in mind, trying to eat the animal, then macharivba, then it actually interferes, meaning if you have in mind to slaughter this animal that was set aside as a sin offering as an ola, it undermines the sin offering and thereby makes it an invalid sin offering. But but when you are thinking about something that is very different, namely chulin, namely something that you're going to eat, something that's not going to be set aside for the Beis Hamikdash, even though you already set aside this animal, and so you're just slaughtering it for the wrong purpose. Lo makariba, then it doesn't interfere with your effort to bring it as a sin offering. So urminhu, but one second, doesn't the following Mishnah suggest the opposite? Meaning suggest that when you have something that is more similar, it's going to be more okay than when it's more different. That the greater the difference will be more of an undermining, because kol aget shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul, that a get written for not for this particular woman is going to be invalid. Va'afilu l'shem ovadis kochavim nami pasul, and even if you were to write it for somebody who's not Jewish. And Rashi tells us, it's Rashi 1, 2, 3 from the top of the narrow lines. It's 9, 15, 12, 15, about 18 lines down. Va'afilu l'shem avodas kochavim. That since we learned that that if it's not for this particular woman, it implies not for this particular woman. But it was written for some other woman. Koldahu, anyone. But listen, just as chulin has nothing to do with a sacrifice, so too an idolatrous woman, a woman who's not Jewish, has nothing to do with gittin. And so, as a result, I might have thought that if Rav's statement was right, then having in mind an idolatrous woman should be like having no one in mind, and thereby it should be okay. The labes gerushin he mahanya, and so as a result, it helps lipsul and causes it to be puzzle. Alma delav mina machariba. So we see that even when something is not similar at all, it's not in the parsha at all, it's still going to interfere. So how? Given this fact that we have this ruling in connection with Gittin, how can we possibly think that having in mind that slaughtering an animal that you had set aside as a sin offering, instead and having in mind that you're going to eat it as a chulin, because you're not it's not sanctified at all, then how could that possibly result in a valid sacrifice? It should be just like having a get for an idolatrous woman, which doesn't work. The shani, and so Rava explained that here's the answer. Gay, if when it comes to a get, dal ovedis kochavimina, remove the thought of the woman, of the idolatrous woman, completely from it. Meaning that if I were to instead have no one in mind, havale stama, you'd end up with a stam get. Ustama puzzle, and as we saw yesterday, a stam get is invalid. So kodshim, but when it comes to kodesh dal chuminayu, so remove your whole concept of thinking that it was going to be chulin completely. And what do you have left if you're removing the actual intention that you had? You're causing there to be no intention. Havale stama, and now you end up with a sacrifice that it was offered with no specific intention. Ustama ksherim, and when it comes to sacrifices, a stam having no specific intention allows that sacrifice to remain valid. And so what we see is that again there is this distinction that you can be too different. So different that actually it does not interfere with what you are trying to do, and therefore it's going to be a valid offering.
Okay. Valid for what? Valid to eat? You're just offering
no. Valid as the original offering. Meaning, as we saw yesterday, even though you might have done something improper, you need to go back to the original offering process and continue it from there. But and you have not interfered with it. So if you were intending this to be a shlomim, then it continues on as a shlomim, and you fulfill your obligation. If you had made a neder to bring a shlomim, you will have brought your shlomim if you had in mind chulin when it was slaughtered. And similarly, any other sacrifice. So again, if it's a chatas offering, it will be valid. Everything will be okay. Even though you originally intended this, you had this animal set aside as a sin offering because, God forbid, you got confused about two pieces of meat and it was actually chaylev that you ate. And so now you have this offering set aside and you forgot which animal it was, and you go and you're getting ready to slaughter it, and you slaughter it for the purposes of eating, and then you realize, hey, oh no, that was the animal that I actually had set aside for a sin offering. Turns out you're okay. It can still be used as a sin offering. Now, I think the slaughtering actually has to happen in the right location. So, of course, it's a little bit odd that you would have this wrong intention in mind when you're, in the north quarter of the section of the Beis Hamikdash where they slaughter animals, but nonetheless that's the basic part that we're talking about, because we're not saying that the person had the animal in an improper location. So the location is fine. It's just the intentions that were wrong. So hard to when you get down into it, it's hard to imagine this happening. But again, the point is that somebody had in mind the wrong intention when they slaughtered the sacrifice that was set aside for a sin offering. So that can still be a sin offering, and you don't have to get another animal.
Suppose he doesn't remember just at all. I mean, he goes up to the bima and he just doesn't remember why he brought it.
Well,
Remembers the
again,
original
the good
intent.
news is that generic intention is sufficient. So if he just says, "I have in mind whatever I was supposed to do," then that's totally fine. That would work. It's only if he has in mind the wrong intention that it would undermine. And that's why we saw yesterday that the rabbis go so far as to say, go ahead and have stam intention. Don't have specific intention.
Right.
Because if you have specific intention, you could have mistaken intention. And mistaken intention could cause the korban to be invalid. Whereas if you just have generic intention, everything will be okay. Okay. The Rama Milsach Risi. So now the third contradiction. Mi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rab Hachata Shechata L'Shem Ola Psula Shchata L'Shem Chulin Ksheira. Same basic statement that again, if the chatas is slaughtered for the sake of an ola, it's going to be invalid. But if it's for the sake of chulin, it's going to be valid. Alma demina machariba. So again, we see that the same kind, meaning offering it as a sacrifice, thinking about a sacrifice that's different, is going to interfere. But the lomina, when it's a different completely, lo machariba, then it doesn't interfere with what you're trying to do. Vatanya though, but we have a brisa. Now this brisa is about the concept of tuma in vessels that are earthenware. And there's an interesting rule in connection with earthenware vessels, and that is that not only do they themselves become tameh, but when they are tameh, the entire internal airspace becomes tameh. Now, that is true, as we are going to see, tocho, in the earthenware vessel itself, below tocho, but not inside another vessel that is internal to that, as Rashi tells us. Rashi tells us, helps us understand all of this. Tocho, it's from the bottom of the narrow lines, it's about 15, 16 lines up. Tocho, kol kli cheres, when it comes to any earthenware vessel. The low tocho, but not the internal airspace of a vessel inside it. Kli hamunach betanor. If, for example, most of the ovens in those days were earthenware vessels, so as a result, we're talking about the outer vessel being a tanor, an oven, upiv, and the mouth of the internal vessel lemala min api tanor. The mouth, meaning again, to just picture it, imagine a cylinder. Maybe it's a cylinder where the top is more narrow than the bottom. And now inside that cylinder, you have another vessel, and that inner vessel, its mouth is above the mouth of the tanur, of the oven, of the outer vessel. And so as a result, the ochlin umashkin betocho, and in the inner vessel, because after all, you're trying to heat something up, there is drink and food in it. The sheretz betanur, but there is some kind of creepy crawly thing in the oven. And so now the question is, does a sheretz makes things tameh? It's in the airspace of the oven, and so as a result, everything in that airspace becomes tameh. But because the food and the drink are in the inner vessel, and the inner vessel's mouth is above the mouth of the oven, so it can't. So as a result, the space inside the inner vessel is not. The opening to the inner vessel is not within the airspace itself. So as a result, the surroundings of the inner vessel effectively block the airspace of the oven. So ochlin should bekalim tahorin. So that that food that is in the inner vessel is going to be tahor. V'hachi amrin b'toras kanonim. And this is, we learn this out in the Midrash on Vayikra. Aval haya piv b'tocha tanur. If the mouth was in the oven, toko karinam beit, it would still be considered internal. And that's why the mouth has to be above the rim of the oven. And so what do we see here? We afilu kli shetef matzil. And even if that inner vessel was made out of metal or some other material that you can immerse in order to make tahor, because remember, a earthenware vessel you cannot just put into the mikvah in order to make it tahor. It essentially needs to be broken down and remade, whereas a metal vessel can just go into the mikvah. And a metal vessel is usually made tameh by touching. And what we are learning here is that the inner vessel, as long as its mouth is not within the well, even if the mouth was in, but the inner vessel itself does not become tameh through being in the oven. It's only through touching. And we're dealing with a situation where the inner vessel is essentially not touching any of the wall of the oven. And so as a result, there is no touching. It's only because it's in the inner space. And so what do we see? We see here that even a different material is going to block the connection. And so as a result, here we have a different material causing blockage, whereas when you have something completely different with respect to the sacrifice, it doesn't do blockage. It allows the sacrifice to be valid when you think about chulin instead of a chatas. So how could that be? How could Rav say his statement? Vishani, and Rava answers this apparent contradiction by saying, Asu chulin eitzel kudshim. When you have chulin next to kudshim, that's kemechitza eitzel tanur. That is like a partition with respect to an oven. A partition, meaning that ma mechitza eitzel tanur lo mahanya la klal, just as a mechitza within an oven does nothing. Meaning that if you have a creepy crawly thing on one side of a partition in an oven, and then you have the partition in the oven, and now when we say a partition, we're talking about some kind of wall in the oven, not another vessel, but rather a wall in the oven. So then it does nothing. Achulin eitzel kachim lo mahanya leklal. So too, when you have in mind chulin with respect to a sin offering, it's as if you haven't done anything. And so as a result, because you haven't done anything, therefore it's like you had no intention, and therefore it's going to be a valid sacrifice. And the analogy is to just like a wall within the oven, it does nothing. It's as if the wall isn't there. Ditanan, because we have a Mishnah that says this, Tanur shechatzot b'nisarim oviyriot. If you have an earthenware oven that is partitioned with boards or curtains, v'nimtza sheretz b'makom echad, and you got a creepy crawly thing on one side of the oven, hakol tameh, the whole thing is tameh. And similarly, kaveres shehi pechusa, if you have some kind of hive basket, this is a basket that they would use to put a beehive in it, uvekuka vakash, and it's pesuch pechusa, it's in bad condition, so there are lots of holes in it, and therefore it's not considered a kli. And yet ufekuka vakash, and you plug it up with straw. And Rashi tells us that we're dealing with a situation where even with the straw, it doesn't make it into a valid vessel. It's still it's still not a kli. Umishul sheles la'avira tanur, and now you hang it into the airspace of the oven. So even though the opening of this plugged up basket is not in the oven, it's just hanging there. we can say sheretz betocha if you had a sheretz inside that hanging basket. Hatanur tameh, the oven is tameh, and similar sheretz betanur ochlin shebetocha tamein. Similarly, if the sheretz is in the oven, the food that would be in that basket would become tameh. So, and the reason is because that basket is not considered a valid kli. And so the key is that when it's considered not so different, so then it's going to be invalid. Rabbi Eliezer Matayar, and Rabbi Eliezer says it's tahor. And so we see that the point is that when it comes to chulin, we're going to say that that is like a divider that doesn't do anything. And so as a result, chulin is like a divider that doesn't do anything, and therefore there's no impact of the chulin of having in mind chulin at all. And so as a result, the sacrifice is going to be valid. The Rabbi Eliezer Mitahar. However, Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with this ruling, and he says that you know what? Whether it's a partition, whether it's the plugged straw hive, it's going to be a good division. Because Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Kal v'chomer, I'll tell you a Kal v'chomer. Im hitzil b'meis hachamor, when it comes to a dead body, which is a very strict kind of tuma, and low satz, the partition, a regular partition in a room, if you cut up the airspace so that you don't have any entrances from one side to the other, well, then that is going to stop tuma of a human corpse to go from one side of the room to the other side of the room. So as a result, lo satzil b'chli cheretz hakal, well then certainly a partition should prevent one half of the oven from becoming a tameh from the other half when it comes to the tuma of a sheretz. So Amru Lo, the rabbi said, I understand your kal v'chomer, but it's not a good one. Lo, not true, because as we turn to Gimel Amabet, im hitzil b'meis chamor, okay, you're right that a partition does help with respect to the stringent nature of human tuma, but shekain chokin oelin. But that is because it is and this is the following the aleph in the Shita Mikubetzes, that it is because a partition works for humans. When you have a partition in in a human dwelling place, that is in fact what that in fact works. We view it as a divider, meaning from a human perspective, it does divide. Tatzil b'kli cheres hakal, but does that necessarily mean anything with respect to an earthenware vessel, which is more lenient? She'ein cholken b'chlei cheres. People don't have partitions in an earthenware vessel like that, and they don't. It's not really considered a partition. You may have made it, but it's not something that people would ordinarily do. And so it's not seen as separating two different areas. So that's the Baraisa. And so again, we have seen that what were we trying to prove from this Baraisa? We were trying to prove that a simple partition in an oven doesn't do anything. And so similarly, saying chulin doesn't do anything with respect to a sacrifice, with respect to a chatas. So ha-teinach l'rabbanan. Okay, you are right that we can make that analogy for the rabbis. But l'Rebbe Eliezer, my ikal meimar. But Rebbe Eliezer says that a partition does work, that it effectively constitutes something different. And so as a result, how can he say, according to Rebbe Eliezer, how can Rav say that that having in mind chulin instead of a sin offering is going to be okay? It should be a partition and it should interfere. So Rebbe Eliezer kal v'chomer kamer. Rabbi Eliezer is based on this Kal V'chomer that he made. And here, let's say we don't have a Kal V'chomer, and so therefore, because we don't have the Kal V'chomer in connection with Chulin, we'll say that we're okay, and that's why Rav can say what he says. But hachi hasam nami lema Kal V'chomer. But we can have a Kal V'chomer over here. There's no reason we couldn't, because after all, Kodshim Mechalin Kodshim, when it comes to holy things, they can cause them to become profane, meaning having in mind the wrong type of sacrifice will cause the actual version of the sacrifice to become invalid. So chulin lo kol shekain, well then certainly when it comes to causing profaneness, something that is by its nature chulin is profane should certainly cause profaneness. And of course that underlying this Kal V'chomer underlies the whole issue with Rav, the amazing aspect of Rav's statement. So in fact, we need to come up. How can it be that Rabbi Eliezer is going to be consistent with Rav's reasoning? So Elataima de Rav ka Rabbi Eliezer. No, so Rav's thinking is like Rabbi Elazar. Now, this Rabbi Elazar is not the Rabbi Eliezer that we just mentioned. This is Rabbi Elazar is an Amora to Amar Rabbi Elazar, because what did Rabbi Elazar say? My time at the Rav. What's Rav's reasoning? Lo yichalalu es kodshei b'nei Yisrael es asher yarimu la'Hashem. That we have a pasuk. The pasuk is in Vayikra Parakaf Bet pasuk Tesvav, and it says, "They shall not profane the sacred things of the children of Israel, that which they will separate unto Hashem." And what's the implication of this verse? Kodshim, mechalim kodshim, that what this verse is specifically telling us is that you need holy things in order to profane holy things. Meaning that if you have in mind chulin, and let's just read the next words, ve'ein chulin mechalim kodshim, having in mind chulin does not cause remarkably profaning of sacred offerings. And so it's basically a Gzeris HaKasav that says that the Kal V'chomer doesn't work. So, Alma Asa Krav Apke Min Kal V'chomer. So what are you saying? You're telling me that there's a verse that comes and preempts the Kal V'chomer. Well, Hachanami. Well, 1 second. We could say that the same thing is true here. We could say the following. Leise Tocho. What do we have? We have the Gzeris HaKasav of Tocho. Labke Mikal V'chomer. And so that should come and undermine Rabbi Eliezer's Kal V'chomer. Because what does Tocho say? We say Tocho v'lo toch Tocho, meaning that we focus only on the internal airspace of the oven slash earthenware vessel itself, and we don't include in that airspace the airspace of an internal vessel that is internal to that to the outer vessel. And so what does that show? That shows that we should reject the whole partition argument because it's tocho and not toch. And so as a result, shouldn't, just as the pasuk of lo yichalalu es kodshei b'nei Yisrael es asher yarumu la'Hashem, that only kodshim can profane kodshim, shouldn't that same argument, and therefore we don't say the Kal V'chomer by kodshim, shouldn't we therefore also similarly say, don't say the Kal V'chomer by the vessels either, and the partition shouldn't work? So no, we do that toko argument does not work because hai toko mi baile. We actually need toko not to teach us toko velo toko, but toko mi baile lo ochlen shegiblan betit. Because according to Rebbe Eliezer, we need toko to tell us that if it's inside the airspace, it's going to be tameh, even when the food itself is completely wrapped by clay. So v'achnisan la'avir tanur, and now that food is completely wrapped by clay, and you put it inside the oven. Salkatay dekamina, I might have thought hawil uvenigia lo metame, because it cannot contract tuma through touching, because the entire food substance is covered by clay, so there is no possibility of touching the food itself. Ba'aviro nami lo mitam. And so as a result, I would think that even in the airspace, it won't become tame. So kamash malan, so we're going to say, no, the fact that the Torah tells us Toho tells us that it's going to be that even the food that is completely wrapped by clay will be considered tame if in that oven. So
Well, how's
v'rabbanan,
that? I mean,
what?
don't we hold that if someone, for instance, double wraps like a potato and puts it inside an oven that's not kosher, the potato is kosher.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that is because on some level, tuma and kashrus do not necessarily always go together because kashrus is based on bulia, on sort of absorption, and we say that there's no absorption when you have the double wrapping, whereas here, it's not just based on that. It's based on what's considered inside, and this is considered inside. It could also be that here we only have one level of wrapping as opposed to two levels of wrapping. So those are two thoughts in terms of that answer.
And
So
if they had two levels here,
it's only one level
I
because if,
understand that, but
oh
it's
yeah, if there were two levels, maybe it wouldn't be. In fact, of course, remember that if in fact, instead of just having a layer of clay, instead you had an actual clay vessel, then it would work. It would prevent it from becoming tame. The inner wrapping of that of the food would actually constitute its own vessel. And it's only because the wrapping that is effectively directly on the food is not a vessel, but rather just considered a wrapping and therefore encasing of the food. That's why it doesn't work. But if it in fact were a true vessel, then it would work. So it's important to understand, to recognize that. The Rabbanan, Hanach lo tzrichi kra. According to the rabbis, they don't even think you would ever think that the food that's wrapped in this way would not become tamei. Of course, it would become tamei, and so that's why they can use tocho to tell you vinlo toch tocho, and not in something that's internal. Okay, so we've now dealt with the three different contradictions that Rava resolved in an amazing way that really felt that had Ravina telling Rav Papa that you really missed the great Dvar Torah. So, but now we're going to discuss another apparent contradiction, but two more apparent contradictions. One offered by Rav Yosef Bar Ami, and then Rav Chaviva, all based on, again, this same statement of Rav, that we're just trying to show that even though it seems like Rav's statement that slaughtering a chatat for a different kind of sacrifice is going to be problematic. Well, actually, we're going to see it's a slightly different statement. So let's take a look at the
so
statement.
with this thing with chulin, just to clarify, he thought it was initially it was a chatas, now he makes it a chulin. But a chatas is it what do we mean by chulin? Chulin, as opposed to kachim, is just food that's not sanctified. It's not a specific designation of the korban.
Correct, correct.
So
That's
how are
exactly
we
part of the point.
so
So the
what does it
person
mean?
slaughtered it, thinking he's remarkably in the base of Migdash. He forgets where he is, and he says, "Okay, we're going to eat this animal." You know, he doesn't have in mind at all slaughtering it for a sacrifice. Instead, he thinks that he's going to slaughter it in order for people to eat it.
So
And
just
then
having a
he
barbecue? Just like okay,
yeah. He think, of course, he's in the base of Migdash because he's got to be slaughtering it in the right location. So
right.
because it can't be outside. So he's slaughtering in the right location. He daydreams for a moment. He says, "Oh, I'm looking forward to a barbecue. Oh, maybe I'll just slaughter this animal for a barbecue." And then he looks up and he says, "Oh, whoops! This is the base of Migdash." And he calls over the local rabbi and he says, "Listen, I had in mind that I was going to slaughter this animal to eat it, but obviously I'm in the base of Migdash and it was really a korban chatas of Joe Schmo. And so what do I do?" And thankfully, the Kohen Gadol or whoever it is that he's asking the question says, "You know what? You don't have to worry about it because you had in mind chulin. That's okay. We'll treat it as if you had stam in mind, and therefore it's going to be a valid sacrifice." And then the potentially unfortunate owner of that sacrifice who was bringing the sin offering, thankfully doesn't have to bring a new sin offering. Okay, so Rav Yosef Bar Ami Rami Shinui Kodesh Ashinui Balim. Well, in second, what's the story when you change the intention with respect to the nature of the sacrifice versus the changing with respect to the ownership of the sacrifice? Umeshani, and he also resolved it. Because what was the contradiction? Mi Amar Rav, we have Rav's statement. Chatas shishchata l'shem chatas kshera. That if you slaughter a sin offering for another type of sin offering, meaning that you and Rashi tells us that if you had if the person sinned with eating chalev, and the person who slaughters it has in mind that this is a sin offering for somebody who consumed blood, that's still going to be valid. But l'shem ola psula. But if you had in mind that it was for an ola, then it's invalid. So what does that show? Alma delamina machariba, meaning that if it's different, if it's too different, it's going to create blockages. Demina lo machariba. But if it's very similar, then it's not going to cause blockage. V'amar Rabba, 1 second, Rav said, chatas shishchata al mishim mechuyev chatas psula. But the Rav said that if you have in mind the wrong person, if you slaughter a sin offering and you just have in mind Joe instead of Shlomo, so then al mi mishim mechuyev ola kshera. So if it's for somebody so if it's for somebody who is obligated with a sin offering, it's going to be invalid. But if it's for somebody who's not obligated for a sin offering and is only obligated for an ola, it will be okay. So again, Joe is bringing a chatas. You slaughter it thinking that it's Shlomo's ola, and you know what? It still works as Joe's chatas. So Alma davar mina machariba. So we see that if it's similar, it's going to cause more interference. And delav mina, if it's more different, because you're having in mind somebody else with an ola, lo machariba, it's going to be not interfere. Umeshani. And yet, Rav Yosef Bar Ami explained this is not actually a contradiction. Because the Torah says in Vayikra Perak Daled Pasuk Lamed Gimel that he slaughtered it as a chatas. V'harei chatas l'shem chatas nishchata. Even if he slaughtered it as a chatas for the wrong, even if he slaughtered it as long as he slaughtered it for a sin offering, it's going to still be valid. And so even if it's a different kind of sin offering, it still works. But hacha v'chiper alav ksiv. But it also says in Vayikra Perek Daled Pasuk Kafvav that it has to be for him. Alav v'lo al chabeiro. So it needs to be for him and not for some friend. Chabeiro dumya didei. And it's got to be somebody who's like him. So if you have in mind somebody else's ola, that's not like him. That's a different situation. Shemechuyev kapara kamoso. This is according to the Masoras Hashas, changes the language. It needs to be somebody who has the same kind of requirement for atonement. And so therefore we have eliminated the apparent inconsistency.
Does it have to be the same sin?
No, it doesn't have to be the same sin. Again, if it's somebody who sinned, it's not going to work. So again, if the Kohen sacrifices Joe's chatas in order to thinking that it's Shlomo's chatas, that's bad news. Joe needs to bring a new chatas. Assuming that Shlomo also was bringing a chatas. But if in fact he thinks that it's Shlomo's ola, now it does work because it wasn't the different sacrifice. Because the point is that you're allowed. The Torah tells us that you have to have in mind a chatas and you have to have in mind the right person. And so as a result, as long as you have in mind either the chatas, or if you have nothing in mind, or if we could say that it's so different that we treat it as if it's a stam having intention, and because the Ola is completely irrelevant, an Ola for someone else is completely irrelevant to Joe. So as a result, from Joe's perspective, it's as if whoever the Kohen who slaughtered it had nothing in mind, and therefore having nothing in mind works. So Rav
So
Chaviva
that'll
Rami,
work. So that we have a problem with the chatas and Ola is okay, but would this also apply? Would it also be okay for, say, a shlomim or a korban
no,
pesach?
no, no. So again, as long as it's for somebody else, you're going to be okay because that's two different. But remember, if it's for you, that was the situation that we saw at the beginning of the Gemara that Rav said. That Rav says, if I have in mind an Ola for you instead of a Chatas for you, that's going to be a problem. Then it wouldn't be valid, and you'd have to bring a new animal. So
Right. If
it's a
it's
combination. You have to have both the if you have two different, meaning if you think that it's the wrong person and the wrong sacrifice, you're going to be okay with the chatas. If it's the right person and the wrong sacrifice, you're going to be wrong with the chatas. You're going to have a problem with the chatas. So that if you have the right person and the wrong sin offering, you're also going to be okay because it's still a sin offering. So those are the three different situations. All right. So Rav Chaviva
well,
Rami.
how does it? Would it apply to a shlomim or a korban pesach?
So, Korban Pesach, we saw also you having the wrong intention. That was the Mishnah at the beginning of the
Right.
Masechet. Is going to be problematic as long as it's on the right day. But a Shlomim, if you have the wrong intention, we saw is going to be okay. It's not going to be invalidating that sacrifice. And we're going to touch on that, God willing, I think
I'm
tomorrow.
just saying, suppose it's you bring your shlomim and you want the shlomim for another person. I mean, it's still a shlomim. It's not a
Yeah,
chat.
so then it'll be fine. Again, the wrong intention is going to be fine with respect to Shlomim.
And korban pesach.
But not Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach is going to be a problem. If you're bringing it at the right time of a Korban Pesach, it's going to be a problem because that you need to have everything right.
So it has to be the right person.
Correct,
Okay,
correct.
it can't be a different person.
Absolutely need the right person involved.
So-
So Rav Chaviva Karami, so Rav Chaviva also had a contradiction, similar contradiction. Shinui ba'alim atok toko. That he says, 1 second, when it comes to changing an owner, and when it comes to the interior of the interior, so, and yet, Umishani, and he answered it because of the following. Umi Amar Rav, didn't Rav say, if you offer it for the wrong person who is obligated with a sin offering, so then the sin offering is going to be invalid, even though you had in mind the right korban, you had in mind the wrong person. But but if you have in mind the wrong person, but the person is not subject to bringing a korban chatas, but only an ola, well, then it's going to be okay. It's going to be valid because presumably, I guess you're still having in mind the sin offering, but now you're having in mind the sin offering for somebody who isn't obligated in a sin offering, and so as a result, it's as if you had no one in mind, and therefore we're going to say that it's going to work. Alma demina machariba. So we see that if it's more similar, it's going to be a problem. And delamina lo machariba. And when it's not as similar, it's going to be okay. But vahatanya tocho below tocho. But we see that when it comes to the interior, if it's more afilu kli shetef matzil, that even if the internal material is completely different, it's going to be okay. And yet the internal the point is that even things that are not alike will cause interference. And so how can you say, that something that's so different as an ola does not cause interference? Umishani arba tocho tchisive. The pasuk refers to 4 different tochos because the pasuk v'kol kli cheres, the pasuk is vayikra yud aleph pasuk lamed gimel v'kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho kol asher b'tocho yitma oto b'sishboru. It refers to tocho twice in that pasuk, and really it could have said toch each time, and so we have effectively 4 lessons: toch, tocho, toch, tocho. Both times it could have said toch, and it says tocho, and we only really needed 1 toch. So chad legufei. So as a result, 1 time it teaches our main lesson. V'chad l'gzeira shava. and one time it teaches us the Gzeira Shava, and that Gzeira Shava is that a sheretz contaminates an earthenware vessel through its interior even without touching it. So if the sheretz is in the airspace but never actually touches the oven, it will cause the entire oven and the oven's airspace to become tamei. Chad toko shel zeh wants to tell you that it's the only an earthenware vessel has this rule below toko shel acher, and not interiors of other utensils. So if you hang a sheretz in the airspace of a metal pot, that nothing happens. The metal pot stays tahor. Everything in the metal pot stays tahor that wasn't touched by the sheretz, and so as a result, everything is fine. And idach toko below toko. And the fourth lesson is that it teaches that it only applies to the main interior and not to an interior of an interior vessel, and even interior vessel that is metal will save the food that is inside it. And so therefore we see that in fact we have a specific Xeris HaKasuv that tells us that that's why something that is considered that different is able to interfere. Whereas when it comes to the Korban Ola, and having in mind the wrong person, so because he's only obligated in Ola, and you had in mind the achatas for that person, but he wasn't obligated in achatas, so it's as if, again, we can ignore the whole thing and we can treat it as if it was a stam situation and therefore a valid sacrifice. So let's start on the next dav on Daled Amud Aleph. Minalan deve'inan zvicha lishma. How do we know that you need to perform the slaughter for lishma, for its own sake, that you need to have the proper intention? Meaning we've on some level been assuming that's the case the entire time, but we began with by teaching about the fact that a korban shizvacho shelo lishma is kosher. So how do I know that it's that's what our Mishnah said, right? Kol Zevachim shenizbechu shelo lishman ksherim ela shelo lebalim l'shem chova, but it doesn't fulfill the owner's obligation, but it still remains kosher. Chutz min pesach v'chatas. That was what our Mishnah said. And so now we're saying, how do I know that you need lishma? After all, it's going to work. It's still going to be a valid korban. So to Amar Kra, v'im zevach shlamim karbano, if his korban, if his offering is a zevach shlamim, shetehei zvicha, zevach refers to slaughtering, and so therefore shetehei zvicha l'shem shlamim. It shows that he needs to have the slaughtering has to be for a shlamim. Well, how do you know that that's not the name of the korban? Zevach shlamim is just the name of the korban, not telling you that his offering is slaughtered as a shlamim. It just means that his offering is a zevach shlamim, meaning that that's the name. Midaksiv hamakriv as dam hashlamim. No, it can't be that that's the name, because look elsewhere in the Torah. We have in Vayikra Zayin Pasuk Lamed Gimel, it refers to the one who offers the blood of the shlamim, and then also earlier in Parak Zayin Pasuk Yudalid, it refers to Hazorek as Dama Shlamim, one who throws the blood of the shlamim. V'lo ksiv zevach. In both of those cases, it doesn't say the word zevach. So and so that can't be the name. V'hacha ksiv zevach. And here it specifically writes the word zevach. It doesn't need to. Shma mina shetehei zvicha l'shem shlamim. So it shows that the slaughtering has to be for the right purpose, for the sake of the shlamim. So there are 4 key blood-related steps for a sacrifice. There they are: the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the bringing of the blood to the altar, the throwing of the blood on the altar. And so we found a source for needing proper intention for the first of these, namely the slaughtering. And so now the Gemara is going to address the need for the other 3. But for that discussion, please stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.
So what is the case again? The case again with them. If a person brings the korban initially for himself, but it can be used for another person. In case, for example, an
So
Ola,
uh,
he thinks it's initially a chata, and then yet he doesn't use it, and then the other person can use it as an Ola. Is that what we're?
no, that is not what we're talking about. And indeed, that doesn't work. In fact, that never works. If you set aside an animal for a particular sacrifice, it cannot be, the nature of that sacrifice cannot be changed. The question is, if you have the wrong intention during the slaughtering of that animal, can it still stay as a valid offering of the nature you wanted it? So again, for a chatas offering, so Joe is bringing a chatas offering, and he says to the Kohen, "Listen, Kohen, Katz the Kohen, please slaughter this as a sin offering because I ate chalep." And so and Katz the Kohen slaughters it accidentally, thinking in mind that Joe had blood, had dam, and as a result, he offered it as the wrong sin. But he had in mind Joe, and he had in mind Chatas. Rav tells us that that's okay. If instead, and Joe has fulfilled his obligation to bring the sin offering for his eating of chalev. On the other hand, if in fact, when Katz the Kohen slaughters it, so he has in mind Shlomo, who ate blood, and so as a result, he has the, or maybe ate chalev, he had the same sin. So he had in mind the wrong person, but that wrong person was obligated in a sin offering. Now nothing is valid here. And so as a result, the whole thing goes away, and both Shlomo and Joe need to bring new sin offerings. I mean, Shlomo hasn't brought one yet, so his sin offering may still be valid, but they both will still need sin offerings in order to accomplish their atonement. The third case is, again, Joe ate chalev, brings a sin offering to Katz the Kohen. Katz the Kohen has in mind Shlomo instead of Joe. But this time, Shlomo didn't do anything wrong. Shlomo was bringing an Ola, but he had in mind Shlomo with respect to a sin offering. And so as a result, the sin offering for Joe still works because the person that Katz had in mind was not actually liable for a sin offering. He was bringing his own Ola offering. And so therefore, we're going to say that Joe does not need to bring a new sin offering. The sin offering that he brought was fine because Katz's intention meant nothing because effectively he was thinking about somebody who wasn't obligated in a sin offering. So it's as if he was thinking about nothing at all, and therefore it's going to be a stam offering, and a stam offering we saw yesterday is going to be valid.
So what is Shlomo doing there?
Well, there are lots of people in the base of
I
Migdash.
understand that, but did he have intent to bring an Ola, or Katz didn't even know? I mean, he just said, "Oh, I got there's someone in the back, Shlomo. I think he's going to bring an Ola." Is that
Yeah, I mean, it could be any of those things. Meaning the point is that no, remember, Katz is having in mind a sin offering for Shlomo, not an Ola offering for Shlomo. Right? He has in mind the right kind of offering. Because if he has in mind the wrong kind of offering, we've already seen that having in mind an Ola when you meant to do a chatas, that's going to make it invalid. But he has in mind the wrong person, but the right korban. If that person was obligated in a sin offering, now the sacrifice is invalid. But if Shlomo was not obligated in a sin offering, he was only bringing an Ola, or he wasn't bringing anything, and he just had in mind the wrong person. He was thinking Joe, Shlomo, they sort of rhyme. I just got myself confused. I had in mind the wrong person, but the person that I had in mind was not obligated to any kind of offering. Well, then it's going to be valid. Then
so?
then the offering will work.
Okay, so why did we mention the word Ola in this whole content in this whole
The
discussion?
point is that the key be the reference to Ola is saying that the is to differentiate Shlomo, who didn't do a sin that's subject to a chatas, from every other Shlomo. So the point is that he could even be obligated in an Ola offering. The key is that he wasn't obligated in a sin offering, and
Uh-huh.
therefore, when Katz has in mind a sin offering for Shlomo, it's as if he had nothing in mind. Because
Oh,
because the Torah only tells us that you have to have in mind somebody who is subject to the same shchatas, that it was subject to a chatas. And if you have in mind somebody that was subject to a chatas, then you didn't do the sin offering for this guy. So as a result, it's a problem. But if the guy that you had in mind wasn't even subject to a sin offering, so then you didn't have in mind, it's as if you didn't have in mind the wrong person. It's as if you had in mind nobody. Because the other person that you had in mind wasn't subject to a sin offering. So that's what it's trying to tell us when it says Ola. It's Lav Dafka.
oh, so it's just that he wasn't obligated,
He's not
not
obligated in
obligated,
a sin offering.
not obligated in a sin offering. That's the point. So
Correct.
therefore, he could have been, I don't know, just there, or
Correct. He
he
was there
could.
because his family was bringing a shlumim. Lots of possible reasons. And so the point is that, in that situation, because there's no atonement that's going to happen for him, so as a result, we can ignore what the Kohen actually had in mind and say that he had nothing in mind because he didn't do anything. It wasn't for another sacrifice that was obligated, and therefore we can say that the sin offering is valid.
So if he was obligated in anything, whether it's a chatas, a korban pesach, or so forth,
No, no,
then
no. If
then it would have been invalid.
No, no. If he's obligated in anything other than a sin offering, it
Right.
stays valid. It stays valid. Only if Shlomo is obligated and also in a sin offering. If both Joe and Shlomo
Oh,
are obligated in a sin offering, then if I have Shlomo in mind instead of Joe, now all of a sudden my sacrifice doesn't work. It's not. It's an invalid sin offering.
uh-huh.
Joe's going to need to bring a new sin offering, even though I had in mind Shlomo. Shlomo's still going to need to bring his sin offering. The whole thing of this animal is, for fallen. It's
I
all,
see.
all,
So,
all
but if
gone.
he was obligated in anything else, if he wasn't obligated in anything, then the sacrifice would be valid for
That's correct because the point is that Shlomo didn't have to bring a sin offering. So my effort to create atonement for him did nothing. And so as a
right.
result, we can view that effort as being stam, as being generic, and now we say generic works. So as a result, Joe's schatas will now still work.
But if he was obligated, Shlomo was obligated, let's say in korban pesach. He wasn't obligated in a chata. He was obligated. He was coming with a korban pesach. Would Joe's
Yeah,
still be
Joe,
valid?
because remember what I or the Katz has in mind when he slaughters the animal is a sin offering for
Right. Okay.
Shlomo. Is a sin offering for Shlomo. I may have said this incorrectly earlier in this year, but I have to be clear. The intention of Katz the Kohen is for a sin offering for Shlomo, but it turns out Shlomo wasn't bringing a sin offering, as
Right.
you suggest. He's bringing a Pesach offering. He's obligated in an Ola. As a result, there's no atonement that for him, and what the Torah tells us is that I have to have in mind the right person with respect to atonement. And if I have in mind the wrong person that has no need for atonement, then it's like I had no one in mind. And as a result, it's stam, and therefore it's going to be valid.
Okay.
All right, Yeshikoach, thank you for helping clarify that. Hopefully, this will really be helpful for those who watch the video. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
Okay. Very good.